At first light, a highway snowplow idled beside a frozen turnout as a gloved hand noticed fabric stiff beneath rime. Measurements taken before names existed. Radios muted, breath fogging notebooks. December holding its silence while evidence waited, orderly, cold, and irrevocable in the pre-dawn quiet of northern Utah winter morning. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The body belonged to 22-year-old Emily Hartman, a college junior home for Thanksgiving who never returned after driving south on State Street, a route bordered by diners, used car lots, and cottonwood breaks along the Jordan River. She was reported missing on November 29, 1988. Her car found days later near a frontage road. Keys absent, purse still inside. Mileage logged by hand in a spiral notebook that would grow thick with dates. Winter came early that year, and with it the familiar pressures of the holidays, when absences feel louder and timelines tighten. When sheriffs ask families to wait 48 hours while snow erases ordinary traces. Emily's disappearance cut through West Valley City with a steady dread, carried by local papers that favored restraint, by church bulletins, by flyers taped near grocery exits, and by a father's careful log of calls. Detectives documented the discovery site with a discipline shaped by decades, noting temperature, wind, and ground hardness, preserving fibers and soil, and recording a time window that stretched backward toward Christmas lights already appearing in storefronts. The autopsy would later suggest a narrow range for death, consistent with exposure to cold rather than injury, a finding that complicated motive and narrowed opportunity, placing emphasis on last known movements and vehicles. Police reconstructed Emily's final day from receipts and bus schedules, from a phone call placed before dusk, from a gas station camera that caught her sedan idling beneath a wreath taped to the window. That tape, grainy and winter dim, showed another car pulling close, its plates unreadable, its driver obscured by glare, an ordinary moment that became extraordinary only after Emily failed to come home. Interviews proceeded methodically. Co-workers from a campus library, neighbors who heard nothing unusual, a former boyfriend cleared by alibi, and motorists who remembered nothing beyond traffic and snow. The case cooled as December deepened, resources diverted to holiday patrols, files boxed and labeled, evidence stored in climate-controlled lockers whose quiet would last for years. Media attention ebbed without spectacle, a few anniversary pieces, a candlelight vigil on Christmas Eve, and a resolution from investigators to keep the record clean should science ever catch up. In 1999, evidence was reviewed under new standards, fibers re-examined, and latent prints compared against expanding databases, yielding exclusions but no name that held. Years passed with the measured patience familiar to cold case units, a patience built from ledgers and calendars, from hope tempered by procedure, from winter after winter of unanswered mail. The turn came quietly in 2016, when a grant funded inventory digitization, allowing Emily's clothing fibers and soil samples to be retested with modern comparative methods. Results suggested contact with a specific automotive carpeting uncommon outside fleet vehicles, a detail overlooked in '88, now pointing investigators toward municipal records and contracted services. Subsequent searches aligned the fiber with a snow removal contractor operating that winter corridor, narrowing the pool to a handful of drivers scheduled during Emily's last hours. One name recurred in logs and maintenance sheets, a man then in his 30s whose routes overlapped the gas station camera and whose vehicle had since been sold through auction. Detectives obtained surviving records, located the vehicle, and recovered trace materials consistent with the archived samples, enough to justify a warrant under contemporary standards. DNA testing, unavailable in the original investigation, provided the final linkage, a lawful comparison between preserved evidence and a reference sample obtained through court order. The arrest came just before Thanksgiving 2018, understated and procedural, announced in a press room that emphasized evidence, restraint, and the long arc of patient work. For Emily Hartman's family, the news arrived with a complicated quiet, a sense of time folding back on itself, December again approaching, calendars marked by absence now intersecting with process. Investigators prepared a comprehensive brief, revisiting every prior exclusion, ensuring chain of custody, and anticipating challenges that accompany memories stretched across 3 decades. The defendant was charged under Utah law, held without spectacle, while prosecutors assembled a narrative rooted in documents, not conjecture, and a timeline anchored to weather reports and work orders. As the case moved forward, the community remembered the winter of '88, the roads slick with brine, the clipped tone of local headlines, and the discipline required to wait for proof. Pretrial motions clarified the science, expert reports detailed probabilities without flourish, and the court set dates mindful of the age of the case and the need for closure. Throughout, investigators returned to their notes from 1988, reading margins written in pencil, trusting that careful work then had preserved truth for now. The approach of Christmas in 2018 carried a different weight, courthouse halls quieter, files moving steadily, a recognition that endings arrive not with noise but with signatures. Trial preparation emphasized restraint, avoiding speculation, foregrounding verifiable links, and honoring the standard that proof must be sufficient, sober, and durable. The narrative returned again to that frontage road, to the gas station camera, to the snow routes, assembling a sequence that aligned without gaps. By New Year's, motions resolved, the court signaled readiness, and the case that had slept for decades stood prepared for a verdict shaped by evidence rather than time. Jurors would later hear a careful chronology, but even before testimony, the record itself told a story of method, of winter patience, and of how small details endure. For a generation that remembers paper maps and handwritten logs, the case resonated as an affirmation that diligence matters, that archives are not graves but bridges. As proceedings approached, Emily Hartman's name appeared again in print, not as a mystery, but as a person restored to the record through proof. The investigation's first chapter closed with preparation complete, evidence organized, and a community bracing for the measured work of justice. Snow returned to the valley, familiar and quiet, mirroring the night of discovery decades earlier, while the courthouse prepared to hear facts preserved against winter. Nothing about the case depended on drama, only on sequence, custody, and corroboration, the steady components that survive scrutiny. The work ahead would test memory and measurement, but the foundation had been laid with care. As winter nights lengthened, investigators reviewed weather charts from 1988, confirming visibility, temperatures, and road conditions consistent with the reconstructed window. They cross-checked payroll times, route logs, and fuel receipts, aligning mundane records into a coherent path. Each confirmation reduced uncertainty, replacing conjecture with documentation. The careful pace honored the standard owed to all parties, particularly in a case where years can distort recollection. By the time jurors were summoned, the record stood complete, ready to be tested. The opening phase concluded not with conclusions but with readiness, a hallmark of investigations that endure. Outside, holiday lights reflected on wet pavement, and the valley settled into winter routines, unaware that a long silence was about to be addressed through law. The case stood poised at the threshold between record and reckoning, its first act complete. December's calendar advanced, marking days that once held uncertainty, now scheduled and certain. The narrative would continue in court, guided by exhibits and testimony, but grounded here in preparation. Winter persisted, and with it the steady resolve to finish what had begun. This account pauses at that point, where evidence meets procedure, and the long view narrows to dates on a docket. The remainder would unfold with deliberation rather than surprise. Records waited, witnesses prepared, and the season turned. The investigation's momentum carried forward, steady and lawful. Nothing further was assumed, everything verified. The quiet of winter remained, but it no longer concealed uncertainty. The case moved on. Preparation gave way to adjudication. Facts stood ready. Time advanced. Winter endured. The record remained. Justice awaited its forum. The story continued. In Utah, winter teaches patience, a lesson learned on roads and in records, and this case carried that lesson forward, setting aside noise, honoring proof, and preparing for a conclusion shaped by law, evidence, and time, with the community watching quietly as the calendar turned. The months ahead would confirm that diligence endures, that careful archives speak, and that answers can arrive without spectacle, bringing measured closure to families, officers, and a town shaped by winter. It was enough to wait, to verify, and to proceed. Nothing more was promised, only the work ahead. The first chapter closed here. Winter held, the court prepared, evidence waited, time would speak, and it did, soon enough, in due course, without excess or haste, only proof. January arrived with a thin inversion over the valley, courthouse steps edged with salt, and a docket that placed the Hartman case among routine filings, its age noted without emphasis. Prosecutors organized exhibits chronologically, beginning with missing person intake forms stamped November 29, 1988, progressing through evidence inventories, and concluding with modern laboratory reports that adhered to current accreditation standards. The approach reflected an understanding that credibility depends on continuity, that old cases survive only when their seams hold under contemporary scrutiny. Investigators revisited original patrol logs to establish the first response timeline, noting radio traffic reductions during snowfall and the practical constraints of winter searches. They documented why certain areas were inaccessible, why dogs were delayed, and how those limitations shaped early assumptions without compromising integrity. Each explanation was supported by weather service archives and municipal maintenance records, turning context into corroboration. The defense signaled intent to challenge memory decay and chain of custody, predictable avenues in long dormant cases, and the state responded by mapping every transfer of evidence across decades, identifying handlers, storage conditions, and audits. Photographs of evidence lockers from the 1990s, temperature logs from the 2000s, and digitization receipts from the grant year were included to demonstrate preservation. Expert affidavits explained the reliability of modern fiber comparison when applied to archived samples, carefully avoiding overstatement. The court's pretrial rulings favored admissibility grounded in method, excluding speculation while allowing scientific linkage presented with margins of error. Jury selection proceeded with restraint, focusing on impartiality rather than emotion, mindful of a defendant presumed innocent until proven otherwise. The community followed developments through measured reporting, local columnists recalling the original winter with a tone of sobriety, emphasizing process over personality. At the university, a scholarship fund established in Emily Hartman's name continued quietly, its annual notice a reminder of the loss without revisiting detail. The trial opened in early February, snowbanks receding, daylight lengthening, a seasonal shift that mirrored the case's movement from archive to adjudication. The prosecution laid out the timeline without flourish, beginning with Emily's return home for Thanksgiving, her errands, and the last confirmed sighting captured on camera. The sequence emphasized ordinary movements intersecting with a work route, narrowing coincidence through documentation. Analysts explained the fiber findings, the rarity of the automotive carpeting, and the statistical basis for exclusion of alternatives. They described how snow removal vehicles of that era were outfitted, how contractors sourced materials, and why the match carried weight without claiming certainty beyond science. The DNA evidence was presented last, contextualized as corroborative rather than singular, with experts detailing collection methods, degradation considerations, and probabilistic conclusions. Throughout, the state avoided narrative excess, allowing records to speak. The defense cross-examination highlighted elapsed time and the absence of contemporaneous DNA testing, but the court maintained focus on whether the present evidence met standards now, not then. Witnesses included retired officers whose notes were contemporaneous and intact, their recollections anchored to paper rather than memory alone. Each testified to procedures followed, deviations explained by winter conditions, and decisions documented. The gas station footage was shown in its entirety, including timestamps and calibration notes, underscoring transparency. Jurors saw the same indistinct vehicle approach, its significance explained through correlation with route logs rather than inference. As the weeks progressed, the rhythm of the trial settled into repetition familiar to seasoned observers, exhibits introduced, foundations laid, objections resolved, all under the steady pace of winter calendars. Outside the courthouse, February storms passed without comment, while inside, charts of routes and schedules aligned into a coherent picture. The defendant's employment records confirmed presence in the corridor during the window identified by autopsy estimates, a convergence supported by payroll times and fuel receipts. Maintenance sheets documented carpeting replacement years later, consistent with attempts to refresh fleet interiors, a mundane act given context through timing. The jury was instructed on weighing circumstantial evidence, reminded that convergence can be as persuasive as direct observation when independent lines align. Closing arguments remained measured, emphasizing law and burden, avoiding appeals to sentiment. Deliberations began under clear instructions, jurors sequestered from commentary, their task defined narrowly by elements of the charge. The wait lasted days rather than hours, reflecting the seriousness with which the panel approached a case spanning generations. When the verdict arrived, it was delivered without spectacle, a finding of guilt supported by the evidence presented. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines, considering the age of the offense, the absence of prior violent convictions, and the impact statements submitted in writing. The court imposed a term consistent with the gravity of the crime, articulating reasons on the record, acknowledging the years elapsed without diminishing responsibility. For Emily Hartman's family, the outcome brought a quiet finality, not relief but resolution, a sense that the record now matched the truth preserved in boxes and ledgers. The defendant was remanded into custody, appeals noted as a right, not a certainty. In the aftermath, investigators closed the file with formal memoranda, updating databases, and returning property where appropriate. The cold case unit conducted an internal review, identifying lessons applicable to other dormant investigations, particularly the value of meticulous early documentation. Media coverage receded again, replaced by follow-up pieces on archival grants and the promise of science applied patiently. The town returned to winter routines, plows running before dawn, diners opening early, the ordinary rhythms continuing. For those who remembered 1988, the conclusion felt subdued, fitting the manner in which the case had been handled. The record now reflected a complete arc from discovery through adjudication, grounded in method. Winter gave way to March, snowmelt tracing routes once mapped for jurors, and the valley moved forward. The case's second chapter closed with a verdict entered, a sentence imposed, and a community reminded that time does not erase evidence when it is kept with care. The process had been slow by necessity, but it had held. The story advanced not through revelation, but through verification, the only durable path in matters of justice. Spring brought runoff to the Jordan River, but the Hartman case remained anchored in winter records, now summarized in appellate filings that reviewed procedure rather than relitigating facts. Defense counsel filed notices focused on evidentiary standards and retroactive application of methods, arguments familiar in long-delayed prosecutions. The appellate court set a briefing schedule that extended into summer, a season that contrasted with the case's origins yet underscored the continuity of process across time. Prosecutors responded with citations to precedent, emphasizing that preservation and validation, not novelty, governed admissibility. The record showed uninterrupted custody, peer-reviewed methodologies, and transparency in error rates, elements courts routinely accept when properly presented. Oral arguments were scheduled without urgency, reflecting confidence in the trial court's rulings. Meanwhile, the cold case unit formalized its review, drafting a procedural memo that cataloged decisions from 1988 onward, noting where constraints existed and how documentation compensated. The memo became a training artifact, circulated quietly among agencies, illustrating how winter conditions and limited technology can still yield durable cases when discipline prevails. Emily Hartman's name appeared in that memo not as a symbol, but as a reference point, a reminder that victims are individuals whose stories depend on careful handling rather than flourish. The appellate hearing itself was brief, focused on law, with judges probing chain of custody details and the statistical framing of fiber analysis. Answers cited exhibits rather than memory, reinforcing the theme that records outlast recollection. Months later, the decision affirmed the conviction, finding no abuse of discretion and noting the trial court's restraint. The opinion was measured, devoid of rhetoric, and emphasized that age alone does not invalidate proof. With that ruling, the legal process reached its terminus, leaving only administrative closures and the human aftermath. The defendant was transferred to a state facility, intake documented, sentence calculated with credit for time served post-arrest. The Department of Corrections issued a routine notice, and the case faded from daily reporting. For Emily's family, the affirmation carried a quiet steadiness, a confirmation that the work done would endure. They declined interviews, choosing privacy, their public statements limited to gratitude for diligence and respect. In West Valley City, the scholarship fund continued, its board adding a line acknowledging the case's resolution without recounting details. Investigators returned to other files, some older, some newer, all requiring the same patience. The Hartman case influenced resource allocation, strengthening arguments for digitization and evidence audits, investments justified not by headlines but by outcomes. A state audit later cited the case as an example of best practices, particularly the maintenance of environmental controls and periodic inventory checks. Those recommendations filtered into policy, small adjustments with long horizons. The winter of 2019 arrived without ceremony, snow falling on the same corridors once mapped in court. Plows ran their routes, contractors logged hours, and the mundane mechanics of winter continued, echoing the ordinary circumstances that had intersected tragically decades earlier. Community memory settled into a quieter register, the case no longer a question but a chapter concluded. Local libraries archived clippings, cataloged under regional history, accessible without prominence. University orientation materials mentioned the scholarship briefly, focusing on opportunity rather than loss. The courthouse moved on, calendars filling with new matters, the Hartman file resting in storage, complete. For the cold case unit, the resolution reinforced a principle understood by veteran investigators and recognized by the audience for whom this account is written. That careful work accumulates value over time. The case did not hinge on a confession or a sudden witness, but on the alignment of ordinary records preserved against winter. Payroll sheets, route logs, maintenance invoices, and weather reports formed a lattice strong enough to support a verdict when paired with modern science applied conservatively. That conservatism mattered, as overstated claims can fracture under appeal. Here, restraint sustained credibility. The autopsy findings, modest in scope, provided boundaries rather than answers, narrowing windows without asserting causes beyond evidence. That humility allowed later science to add weight without contradiction. Witness interviews conducted in 1988, documented verbatim, became anchors, their value increasing as memory faded. Media coverage, subdued from the start, avoided contaminating recollection, a benefit realized decades later when jurors encountered fewer distortions. The town's response, respectful and patient, mirrored the investigators' approach, creating an environment where proof could mature. As the years passed, technology changed, but paper endured, and those papers carried truth forward. For those who lived through that winter, the resolution affirmed a belief in institutions that function quietly, without spectacle. For younger observers, it demonstrated that diligence is cumulative, that archives are active tools rather than relics. The case's quiet aftermath included a bench plaque in the cold case unit honoring teams who preserved evidence, a modest acknowledgement without names. It also included a line item in the budget for continued digitization, justified by outcomes rather than promises. Emily Hartman's story, told here without embellishment, concluded not with catharsis but with closure shaped by law. The seasons turned again, Thanksgiving approaching, then Christmas, the calendar revisiting dates once marked by uncertainty. This time those dates passed with steadiness, the record settled. The work had been done, verified, and affirmed. The lesson remained, that winter teaches patience, and patience, applied methodically, can carry answers across decades. The Hartman case stood as proof that time does not defeat truth when evidence is kept, checked, and respected. It ended as it began, in cold conditions, but with warmth drawn from resolution rather than conjecture. The story moved forward into silence, where completed cases belong, leaving behind a template rather than a spectacle. With the appellate decision settled, the administrative coda unfolded in small, procedural steps that rarely reach public attention, but define how a case truly ends. Evidence lockers were audited one final time, seals verified, and long-term storage determinations made according to statute. Items of no further evidentiary value were cataloged for disposal, while irreplaceable materials were retained under archival protocols. Each action was logged, signed, and dated, a final demonstration of the discipline that had carried the case from winter discovery to legal resolution. The cold case unit issued closure notices to partner agencies whose records had been consulted, thanking clerks and archivists whose quiet labor had proved essential. In the sheriff's office, the Hartman file was reclassified from active to resolved, its digital record locked against alteration, its paper volumes boxed and labeled with a permanence reserved for matters unlikely ever to be reopened. This administrative stillness contrasted with the emotional movement experienced privately by those closest to the case. Emily Hartman's parents, now elderly, met once more with investigators in a conference room overlooking a parking lot dusted with late-season snow. The meeting was brief and factual, a review of the appellate outcome and remaining options, followed by an offer to answer questions. They asked few, content that the record now reflected what had been known in fragments for decades. The exchange ended without ceremony, a handshake, and an understanding that the relationship formed through investigation had reached its natural conclusion. In the months that followed, the case influenced training curricula statewide. New detectives studied the Hartman timeline not for dramatic turns, but for its consistency, learning how winter conditions can delay discovery without negating later accountability. They examined the initial missing person intake, noting how precise descriptions and early documentation preserved avenues that would otherwise have closed. They reviewed the gas station footage analysis, understanding how modest technology, when contextualized properly, can remain probative long after resolution improves. They studied the fiber comparison as an example of how scientific restraint strengthens cases over time. These lessons filtered quietly into practice, shaping investigations that would never bear Emily's name but would benefit from her case's integrity. The broader community absorbed the resolution in subtle ways. Church bulletins ceased mentioning anniversaries, shifting focus to current needs. The local paper archived its final article under court decisions, not human interest. A roadside cross erected years earlier was removed at the family's request. The space returned to winter grasses and plow spray. The act was not erasure but acknowledgement that memory does not require markers when records endure. Thanksgiving that year arrived with familiar rituals, and for the first time since 1988, Emily's absence was not accompanied by unanswered questions. The holidays passed quietly, without the weight of speculation, replaced by a steadier remembrance grounded in facts. In early winter, a legislative committee reviewed funding for forensic grants, citing the Hartman case among examples where delayed testing produced lawful outcomes. The discussion emphasized accountability, chain of custody, and transparency, avoiding promises of instant answers. The committee approved modest increases, framed as maintenance rather than expansion, recognizing that steady investment yields returns measured in decades. That framing resonated with an older audience accustomed to incremental progress, to tools sharpened slowly. Within the Department of Corrections, intake assessments documented the defendant's adjustment, a routine process recorded without commentary. Appeals exhausted, parole eligibility calculated according to statute, the sentence entered the ordinary rhythms of institutional time. The case ceased to generate filings, becoming instead a reference point in footnotes and trainings. In academic circles, a criminology seminar discussed the Hartman investigation as an example of convergence, how independent lines of evidence can align without reliance on confession. The discussion emphasized ethics, cautioning against hindsight bias, and underscoring the importance of documenting uncertainty. Students learned that cold cases demand humility, an acceptance that answers emerge only when records permit. As years advanced, the valley experienced winters like others, some harsher, some mild. Snow fell on State Street, traffic slowed, plows worked their routes. Few remembered the exact turnout where Emily was found, fewer still the measurements taken at first light. Yet those measurements lived on in files, precise and unchanging. The courthouse continued its work, calendars turning, judges rotating, clerks filing. The Hartman case remained complete, a finished chapter in a system designed to outlast individuals. For investigators nearing retirement, the resolution offered a quiet satisfaction, not pride but affirmation that diligence matters. They spoke of it rarely, preferring to let the record speak. For the audience attuned to method rather than drama, the case affirmed values long held: patience, verification, and respect for process. It demonstrated that justice does not require spectacle to be real. The finality achieved did not rewrite the past, but it clarified it, replacing uncertainty with documentation. That clarity allowed memory to settle, to become history rather than rumor. In the years after resolution, the scholarship bearing Emily's name funded students who never knew the case's details, benefiting from a legacy shaped by restraint. Their successes did not reference tragedy, only opportunity. This quiet continuation perhaps best reflected the investigation's tone, purposeful without excess. As winter returned each year, the case receded further into archives, accessible but undisturbed. It stood as an example of how cold cases conclude not with revelation but with confirmation. The narrative here ends where it should, in the ordinary aftermath of law applied correctly, where files are closed, lessons integrated, and communities move forward without forgetting. The Hartman case did not demand remembrance through repetition. It required accuracy, which it received. Time passed, seasons turned, and the record remained, steady and sufficient. Years later, when the Hartman case was discussed at all, it was usually in the context of process rather than tragedy. It appeared in footnotes of training manuals, in quiet conversations among investigators who valued method over momentum, and in grant justifications that argued for patience as a professional discipline. The file itself rested in long-term storage, its spine labeled in block letters, its contents unchanged since final closure. Inside were winter photographs, typed reports yellowed at the edges, laboratory certificates, and the appellate opinion that affirmed the work without embellishment. Together, they formed a complete record, one that required no interpretation beyond what was written. The passage of time did not soften the facts, but it did contextualize them, placing the case among many others where answers arrived slowly and lawfully. In Utah, where winters shape both roads and routines, the Hartman investigation became a reference point for how environment influences policing without excusing failure. Snow delayed searches, darkness limited visibility, and holiday staffing constrained resources, yet documentation compensated where immediacy could not. That balance became instructive, especially to officers trained in eras of instant data, reminding them that records matter most when memory fades. The case demonstrated that precision at intake, even amid uncertainty, preserves options for the future. Emily Hartman's name, once synonymous with absence, became associated instead with completion, a subtle but important shift for those who had followed the story from the beginning. For her family, the years after resolution unfolded without public milestones. They moved through holidays with a steadiness earned through endurance, their private rituals unchanged, their public posture reserved. They declined commemorations beyond what already existed, preferring continuity over ceremony. Their choice reflected the tone of the investigation itself, which had never sought attention. The quiet aftermath suited them, allowing grief to settle into memory without the friction of unanswered questions. In the community, the case ceased to be a topic of speculation, replaced by newer concerns, yet it lingered as a reminder of how ordinary circumstances can intersect with lasting consequences. Roads mentioned in reports were repaved, businesses captured in old photographs closed or changed hands, and the gas station that once provided a grainy timestamp was remodeled, its cameras upgraded beyond recognition. Still, the record preserved those moments exactly as they were, immutable against progress. That immutability gave the case its strength. In law enforcement circles, the Hartman investigation reinforced a principle understood by seasoned professionals. That restraint is not weakness. By avoiding conjecture, by documenting uncertainty, and by preserving evidence without forcing conclusions, investigators allowed later science to do its work without contradiction. The DNA result that ultimately confirmed identity did not overturn earlier findings but complemented them, fitting into a framework already built. This compatibility was not accidental but the product of disciplined reporting. The autopsy, limited in scope, avoided claims it could not support, leaving room for later corroboration. Witness statements, taken carefully, avoided narrative shaping, preserving raw observation rather than interpretation. Each decision, modest on its own, accumulated value over decades. The legal outcome reflected this accumulation. The conviction rested not on a single piece of evidence but on convergence, a concept often misunderstood outside professional circles. Independent lines aligned, root logs, fiber analysis, vehicle records, DNA, and timing constrained by weather. None alone would have sufficed. Together they formed a coherent whole. Courts recognize such coherence when it is built transparently, and the appellate affirmation underscored that recognition. The opinion's language was plain, its reasoning procedural, its conclusion unremarkable in tone, which in this context was a success. It signaled that the case met standards without stretching them. That signal mattered beyond the single matter, reinforcing confidence that delayed justice can still be just. As years passed, the Hartman case influenced policy quietly. Evidence audits became routine rather than exceptional. Digitization projects prioritized older files with intact custody. Training emphasized writing reports for unknown readers decades hence, a mindset shift prompted by examples like this. These changes did not carry Emily's name in public, but they traced back to the lessons her case provided. In that sense, the investigation's impact extended beyond resolution, shaping practice without seeking recognition. For the intended audience, those who have lived long enough to see institutions tested and refined, the case resonated as confirmation that systems can work when they resist haste. It affirmed values of patience, documentation, and respect for process, values often learned through experience rather than instruction. The story's power lay not in shock but in steadiness, in the reassurance that truth can endure when handled carefully. As winters continued to pass, the dates once circled on calendars lost their urgency. Thanksgiving and Christmas arrived and departed without the weight they once carried. The season still evoked memory, but memory now rested on certainty rather than speculation. That shift allowed reflection without dread, a quiet form of closure that does not announce itself. In the archives, the Hartman file remained available, its contents unchanged, its status resolved. It did not require revisiting, only preservation. The narrative reached its end not with final words but with stability. The case was solved, lawfully and verifiably, its outcome recorded and affirmed. The suspect was identified through evidence, held accountable through due process, and sentenced according to statute. The community absorbed the result without disruption, continuing its routines shaped by weather and time. The investigation concluded as it had been conducted, without excess, without spectacle, and without doubt. In the end, the Hartman case stood as an example of what careful work can achieve, even when answers take decades to arrive. It showed that cold cases are not defined by their age but by the quality of their records. It demonstrated that winter, with all its constraints, does not defeat diligence. And it offered a form of closure suited to those who understand that justice is often quiet, methodical, and patient. The story ends there, complete, preserved, and sufficient, resting not on emotion but on proof, where it belongs.